Let's break down every single defense that you guys could possibly pick up off of the waiver wire to help you guys dominate Week 10 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Here are your must-start defenses and streams going into Week 10. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 10 NFL Pick'ems are already starting to go live, and all of their Week 9 NFL Pick'ems for Monday Night Football are live as well. And Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em for either Monday Night Football or Week 10's action. On top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH are also receiving a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em and up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up on Underdog with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. And very quickly, let's just take a look at the bye weeks for the week. We're going to be without the Packers, Browns, Raiders, and Seahawks. So not a lot of stud defenses here. The Packers really the only one we've been taking a strong look at throughout the season. But we have been streaming against the Browns and definitely streaming against the Raiders. So we'll see how that affects things going into Week 10. All right, let's kick the video off with the Philadelphia Eagles defense going up against the Dallas Cowboys. Now, this is a defense that looked like they were going to have a dominant day against the Jacksonville Jaguars and slipped up a bit. Looked like they were going to be a lock for double digits, and they came out with just 8 fantasy points. Ultimately, not exactly what we wanted to get. But what we do know is that Dak Prescott is now set to have an MRI as he is dealing with that hamstring injury. And then on top of that, we have an injury to CeeDee Lamb as well, who has an AC joint, and he is also set to undergo an MRI. So the two most crucial players on this offense are now going to be in question going into Week 10. Now, that's no discredit to my guy Cooper Rush, but we always want to try and stream against backup quarterbacks when possible. So the Eagles in Week 9, like I said, looked like it was going to be a dominant day against the Jags, and they slipped up a bit, but ultimately 2 sacks, 2 interceptions, 215 total yards allowed, and 17 total points allowed. So not too bad. Still a little bit disappointing, but they have 8 or more fantasy points in their last 3 games, 16 fantasy points against the Giants, 8 against the Bengals. They set an 85% roster, so they did shoot up in terms of roster percentage overall with that nice matchup against the Jaguars in Week 9. But if they're out there and available, especially as the week progresses, if things continue to look bleak for CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott, we're going to have a very nice streaming option for the Philadelphia Eagles on the road, against the Cowboys in Week 10. Speaking of the Jacksonville Jaguars, next team I want to take a look at is the Minnesota Vikings. And I will note I have to record these during Sunday Night Football. Currently, at the time I'm recording this, they have 9 fantasy points, but we'll see what happens with the Colts matchup here on Sunday Night Football. But ultimately, I'm just not too worried about it. This unit has still averaged 12.5 fantasy points per game so far on the season. They still sit at 85% rostered, and they have still done a fantastic job in terms of takeaways so far on the season. They have 12 interceptions, 3 scoring touchdowns, 6 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, and 24 sacks, allowing 135 total points on the season so far, And there's a great matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, who continue to be a team that allow for turnovers and just allow for poor offensive play. Now, they do a good job of getting like garbage time points and kind of making an effort towards the end, as Trevor Lawrence still at 21.5 fantasy points, for example, in Week 9, but he also threw 2 interceptions, just found a way to run for 2 touchdowns, but he only threw for 169 passing yards. We know we've got injuries in terms of that offensive roster. The run game was not very effective between Tank Bigsby and Dearness Johnson this past week. Still got names here like Brian Thomas Jr. and Evan Ingram, but ultimately Parker Washington, Gabe Davis not doing a ton. Gabe Davis still banged up, so there's still some hope, I guess, for the Jags offense, but this is still a very good offense to try and stream against. Even if the Eagles didn't give us a double-digit performance this past week, the Vikings can certainly have an opportunity to do so in Week 10. So another highly percentage roster team here in the Minnesota Vikings. But regardless of what happens in Sunday Night Football, I think they are a very solid must-start defense in Week 10. Next up, we have the Detroit Lions sitting at 49% rostered, who are going to travel to face the Houston Texans. This is another team little disappointing in Week 9. Looked like they were going to be a lock for double digits, and we talked about them in last week's video, and I was a bigger fan of starting them if Malik Willis was the starting quarterback, but they almost looked like they're going to be a for sure lock with double digits against an injured Jordan Love in the rain. They did have an interception against Jordan Love. They did have a defensive touchdown. They did allow 411 total yards, but just 14 total points, 8 fantasy points on the day. They've been a really interesting defense. 20 sacks, 7 forced fumbles, 5 fumble recoveries, 10 picks, and then their first defensive scoring touchdown this past week. They had 18 fantasy points in Week 8 as they dominated the Titans at home, 6 fantasy points in Week 7, 20 as they dominated Dallas on the road in Week 6. So look at the Texans, and I'm just not scared of this unit right now. I think that the Lions match up pretty well against them as well. CJ Stroud just not playing fantastic football. 11 of 30 for 191 passing yards, found a way to 59 rushing yards, a fumble and a lost fumble in Week 9 against the Jets. But yeah, I'm just not too scared here. Now, the big kind of factor here is we might see the return of Nico Collins in Week 10. That could certainly change things, right? But the Lions kind of match up well here because, well, Joe Mixon's been running the football down just whatever defense he faces throats, but he's faced the Patriots, the Packers, the Colts, and the Jets in the last 4 weeks. Not necessarily the most stout run defenses. The Lions are one of the best in the entire league. So we're definitely going to have to kind of maybe reevaluate. Maybe we don't have as much confidence in terms of upside if Nico Collins plays this week, as Tank Dell looked very good in Week 9 with 9 targets, 6 grabs, and 18.6 fantasy points. But ultimately, with the kind of low ceiling that CJ Stroud's bringing to the table right now, a couple injuries on this roster, no Stephon Diggs, see what happens with Nico Collins. At the end of the day, the Lions still have a nice amount of upside on the road against the Texans in Week 10. Next up, we have the Chargers, who are going to face the Titans at home this week, and this might be my favorite defense so far on the video. We talked about this stretch a lot coming out of the Week 5 bye week and even going into Week 5. I was telling you guys to try and load up for this stretch for the Chargers. And it started off a bit disappointing. Week 7 against Bo Nix and company. Turns out Bo Nix, not that bad. This was still far earlier in the season, just 7 fantasy points. Turns out streaming against Arizona was very short-lived. Just 3 fantasy points in Week 7 for the Chargers. But then the last 2 weeks, they've been very, very good against backup quarterbacks, right? Week 8, 12 fantasy points against Spencer Rattler and company. Week 9, this past week, 19 fantasy points against Jameis Winston and company. 3 interceptions, a forced fumble, 6 sacks. Allowed just 10 fantasy points. So far on the season, they have 18 sacks, 4 forced fumbles. They've recovered every fumble, 6 interceptions, and they've allowed just 89 points so far on the season. So actually, this was the first game where they had a forced fumble and no fumble recovery. This week isn't equated into the monthly stats, so just correcting myself. But nonetheless, we get Mason Rudolph and company as a great matchup this week. Now, Mason Rudolph's been serviceable. He's certainly no Will Levis, but he has thrown an interception in every game, and he has 4 fumbles in those 3 games that he's played in as well. So he's not as bad as Will Levis, don't get me wrong, but the potential for turnover is still very high when we're facing Mason Rudolph. And this is a home game for the Chargers, which I always like. Ultimately, this is just a good spot in a defense that's been playing well for the last 2 weeks. They're a little bit lower rostered, still not in a great percentage, but at 58% rostered, you definitely have a potential to pick up the Chargers, maybe over some of the defenses that we've talked about earlier in the video. So the Chargers are out there. They're probably my favorite defense to try and pick up off the waiver wire going into Week 10. Next up, let's talk about the Bears, who are going to face the New England Patriots at home this week. And ultimately, this Bears defense has been pretty disappointing in the last 2 weeks. Now, 2 road games in a row against Jaden Daniels and Kyler Murray. So they just haven't looked as stout, as tight. 27 points allowed in week 9, 3 sacks, a forced fumble, 2 fumble recoveries, 350 passing yards allowed. But I think that they have a nice chance to bounce back this week against the Patriots. Now, Drake May has been fine, don't get me wrong. Um, but he threw 2 interceptions this past week. And he had 2 fumbles. One of them lost. Threw for just 206 passing yards and 1 touchdown. And this Patriots offense by no means scares me going into this matchup. So I think we could see something interesting happen with the Bears defense here, where some people just kind of want to get rid of them, don't really trust them. They sit at 42% rostered, so a little bit lower than some of the other teams. They had the bye week in week 7, then these 2 down weeks. So we could certainly already be seeing fantasy managers lose some faith in them. On the season, 20 sacks, 6 forced fumbles. They recovered all those fumbles, 7 interceptions, and a touchdown. So I think that the Bears are in a good spot here at home to bounce back against a rookie quarterback. And Drake May has definitely shown some light in his rookie season and the starts that he's gotten. But the Bears, 2 really bad weeks overall, offensively and defensively. They need to do something, and I think that their defense could certainly step up here in week 10. All right, last but not least, let's take a look at the team playing the Panthers this week, and that's going to be the New York Giants, who sit at just 6% rostered. They had 0 fantasy points this past week. I don't know if I really want to break down their defensive efforts here, but on the season, 35 sacks, 7 forced fumbles, 6 fumble recoveries, and 1 interception. Going into week 9 against Washington, they were the defense 11 on the season. The front 7 has played well at times. They've had some nice performances against Cleveland in week 3. That was Deshaun Watson, though. Against Seattle in week 5, 18 fantasy points, at least 8 fantasy points against Cincy the following week. But here in week 10, well, they're going to face Bryce Young and company, which is always something we want to take a look at. Bryce Young, an interception this past week, 2 interceptions in week 8, just 171 passing yards this past week. So we know that the turnover upside is definitely there for Bryce Young. But we also know that we just can't exclusively stream against Bryce Young all the time. A lot of you guys gave me questions about the Saints defense this past week, and I told you guys, I just don't trust them. They haven't been good. And the Panthers beat the Saints, and the Saints defense did not have a good fantasy outing this past week, as they only put up 3 fantasy points. So, yeah, I think the argument goes both ways here. We don't just want to say, we can for sure stream against the Panthers, but at the same time, we know that the turnover upside is there. So, bye weeks are hitting you. Not a ton of great defenses on bye week this week, but maybe they're affecting things like can't stream against the Raiders, can't stream against the Browns. Whatever it may be, you need a deeper option that should definitely be out there on the waiver wire. The Giants on the road against the Panthers here in week 10 are at least a good floor option as we move into the week. That'll do it for today's video. There are your must-start defenses and streams moving into week 10 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Don't forget, guys, I'll answer every single comment on this video. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, moving into week 10 of the 2024 fantasy football season, drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. And don't forget, guys, as the week goes on, we're going to have everything you could possibly need to dominate week 10 of the 2024 fantasy football season here on the channel. So most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.